Ra, Odin, Zeus, Osiris, Balder, Baal, Jupiter. There are some cool sounding god names in mythologies from around the world, and as a kid I always wondered, why doesn't the god that I worship week after week have a cool name like Thor or Studley McAwesome? We just call out God and Lord, and I always pondered God's actual name. Would it be an awesome name, or would it be something seemingly plain, like Bob? Well, the Bible does give God a divine name, and the history and custom surrounding that name is quite interesting. So let's explore the name of God. Welcome, explorers. God is addressed by many titles in the Bible, such as Lord, Master, Almighty, Lord of Hosts, Provider, Defender, and on and on. And of all the titles and character traits used to address God, there is one special name. This is often called God's divine name, so the Christian God does in fact have a name like the gods of Mercury and Ishvari. But if you expect me just to say the name and end the video here, well, it's not that simple. This is God's name. You are reading that from right to left, aren't you? Hebrew goes from right to left. And God's name is 4 Hebrew consonants, a Yod, He, Vav, and He. These letters together make up the divine name of God, and it is often called the Tetragrammaton, which means 4 letters. But exactly how to pronounce these 4 letters, well, now that is a story. Some scholars will differ, but there's general consensus that the ancient Hebrew Bible, which we Christians call the Old Testament, was written without vowels. It was just written with consonants, and the reader supplied the vowels as they pronounced each word. Fun fact, there are some Hebrew newspapers in the modern era that are printed this same way, just consonants, and they let the reader add the vowels as they read. So this brings us back to the question of how do we pronounce the Tetragrammaton of God's divine name? Well, this brings us to Jewish tradition. The Jews took very seriously the commands not to misuse God's name in Exodus 20 verse 7 and Leviticus 24 verse 16. So they did not pronounce God's divine name every time they came across it in their daily Bible readings or in average conversation. They wanted to respect God's name by not using it in any casual manner. Again, scholarship debates the issue, and some argue that God's divine name was only pronounced once a year by the high priest on the high holy day of Yom Kippur, also known as the Day of Atonement, while other scholars argue that God's divine name would have been used in worship or during the liturgy. But what scholarship is in full agreement is that the pronunciation of God's divine name was not a common occurrence by the people, again, in their daily Bible reading or in conversation. It became custom to not say God's divine name in the fear of disrespecting God by misusing or mispronouncing it. And as you can tell by my pronunciation of Tetragrammaton, I don't live in fear of mispronouncing words, I embrace it. But back to the topic at hand. 2 facts here make the pronunciation of God's name difficult. First, most likely the Hebrew Bible was written and read for generations without vowels. And second, common Jewish custom was not to pronounce God's name out of fear and respect. Now, jump ahead, and vowel points are eventually added to the Old Testament Hebrew text. Scholarship debates when this takes place, but when the vowel points were added, the respect towards God's name is reflected in the addition of these vowels, which brings us to the Masoretes, who were a group of Jewish scribal scholars. Some believe the Masoretes invented Hebrew vowel points, and they created a famous compilation of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament with added vowel points. The Masoretic text is an important text used by all major translations of the Old Testament. Well, they did add vowel points to God's divine name, and there were 2 different vowel points added to the Tetragrammaton, which look like this. And of the over 6,000 uses of the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament, the vast majority of the vowel points are this one. And this word is pronounced Jehovah. Yes, guys, we did it. It's Jehovah. Well, not so fast. These 2 vowel points of God's divine name are near matches to the vowel points of the Hebrew words Adonai and Elohim, and these words mean Lord and God respectively. Now, a few scholars do believe the vowel points that are similar to Adonai are the correct vowel points for the pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton, making Jehovah the correct pronunciation of God's divine name. But this is the minority view. The scholarly consensus is the Masoretes use the vowels from the word you should pronounce rather than attempting to say God's name. So, when you see the vowels for Adonai on God's name, you should read Adonai, meaning Lord, out of respect and not to pronounce God's name. And when you see the vowels for Elohim on God's name, you should read Elohim, meaning God, rather than trying to pronounce God's divine name. Scholarly consensus is that the vowel points that match Adonai on God's name was a reminder to say Lord and not the vowels needed to pronounce God's divine name properly. They use the vowels to remind you of what you are supposed to say instead, which is Lord. So scholarly consensus argues Jehovah, which I grew up on, is a transliteration mishmash of the consonants of God's divine name with the vowels of the word Adonai, meaning Lord. Now later, scholars who were way smarter than me tried to come up with a proper pronunciation of God's divine name, and these scholars settled upon Yahweh. Again, this is somewhat of a scholarly leap. They are not sure whether Yahweh is the proper pronunciation or not. Yahweh is just scholarship's best guess. In fact, scholarship still debates whether God's name should be 2 or 3 syllables. This is evidenced by the 3-syllable Jehovah and the 2-syllable Yahweh. So there is a lot we still do not know about these 4 Hebrew letters that comprise God's divine name. But I want to leave you with 2 fun facts regarding God's name. First, I am sure some of you are watching this video thinking, I read my Old Testament on a regular basis, and if God's divine name is all over the Old Testament, why haven't I ever seen the word Jehovah or Yahweh in my Bible? Where is it? Well, that's a great question. The Christian Church and Christian Bible translators, for the large part, have maintained the Jewish tradition of respecting God's divine name. Instead of saying or writing God's divine name, they substitute Lord in its place. Many times you have read Lord in the Old Testament and you are replacing God's divine name with the term Lord. Now to the fun fact. Most English translations mark when the term Lord is replacing God's divine name. They mark it by writing Lord in all capitals. So when you come across Lord in all capitals, it is a replacement of God's divine name. The problem is, and why most people do not realize what their Bible is doing, is because they use a different font size for the L in Lord and the ORD in Lord when replacing God's name. The L is the same font size as the regular text, and the O, R, and D of Lord are in a smaller text. So the O, R, and D are not as tall as the L, like this. And when it looks like this, how many people reading at any decent pace are going to register the difference between Lord in all caps and a normal Lord? Now, open those eyes, look for that funky various font size all capitals Lord in your Bible, and you can know that this is a replacement of respect for God's divine name. Last fun fact, there is a great chicken and egg scholarly debate regarding God's divine name. The biblical explanation of God's divine name is found in the story of the burning bush in Exodus. When Moses asked God, "What should I say?" when asked, "Who sent me?" God responds, "I am, I am." God's divine name is the form of I am, a statement that God exists and is with us. I am. We do know that I am, or I exist, or I am present is a part of the meaning of God's divine name. We're just not sure how to pronounce God's name. Now, the chicken and egg debate is this. Was the burning bush story written after the Hebrews were already using God's divine name to explain how God's name came into existence, or did the burning bush story happen and then God's divine name develop from that story? What came first, God's divine name or the burning bush story? So to recap, what is the Christian God's name? In simplest terms, it is 4 Hebrew letters, a yod, hey, vav, and a hey. Using the vowels from the Hebrew word Lord upon these Hebrew consonants, the term Jehovah was born. Using the best guess of some Hebrew experts, the term Yahweh was born. So Jehovah and Yahweh are 2 attempted pronunciations of the same thing, God's divine name. Ultimately, we do not know for certain how to pronounce God's name, and we still replace it with Lord in all capitals in many English translations. We do know from the burning bush story that God's divine name means I am, I exist. And I'll let you figure out which came first, the burning bush or God's divine name. I think I'm going to start writing my name JSS and see if anyone can figure it out. And I'm sorry, Dr. Furtado, I know my Hebrew handwriting is awful, but hopefully you all found it helpful. As always, my bibliography is in the description below. Be blessed.